Hello, everyone. My name is Simon Chadwick. I am Professor of Eurasian Sport at EM Lyon Business School. And today we are conducting a podcast, a webcast. I don't know, Yoav, what I call it. We're creating some audiovisual content involving Yoav Dubinsky from the University of Oregon. It's really, really great to have Yoav with us today. Thanks, Yoav, for that.
Thank you for having me.
In my opinion, whatever my opinion counts for, I think Yoav is engaged in some of the most interesting academic work right now anywhere in the world. And of course, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because GeoSport, but also me personally, we have this interest in the intersection of sport and politics and geography and business. And I think what we're going to talk about today is really in keeping with that and within those parameters. Before we go into the details, Yoav, I'll hand over to you and leave you to say a little bit about your work. I know you've published extensively, both journals and also for GeoSport too. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey, moving from Israel to the United States and then your research areas?
Sure. So thanks for having me, Simon. It's great to talk to you. I'm a big fan of GeoSport, and I'm always happy to contribute when I can. I'm originally from Israel, born and raised in Tel Aviv, Israel. I've been a journalist. That's my professional background. And I think my interest in sports nation branding and public diplomacy started to happen after coming back from covering the Beijing Olympics as a journalist and starting to really look at a way that a country is using a mega sport event to try and reshape its image. And obviously you know much more about China and nation branding there than I do. But as someone coming from Israel, who's, let's be honest, not a powerhouse in hosting mega sport events, it was a unique experience for me. And gradually through that, I started to look more on the academic side. I was involved with the International Olympic Academy for years in Greece, in Olympia. And after doing a few degrees, I moved to the US, did my PhD at the University of Tennessee. I wrote my dissertation on Israel's use of sports for nation branding and public diplomacy. And in the last 3 years, I'm teaching at the University of Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon, a small town in Oregon on the Pacific Northwest, branded as Tracktown, USA, a place where is basically the heart and soul of track and field in America, where the US Olympic trials just took place, and obviously very connected to Nike. So the sports marketing scene there is very lively. As you said, I'm interested in the intersection between sports and geopolitics. I put it under the umbrella of country image, so sports and nation branding, sports and public diplomacy, national identity, collective identity, framing, agenda setting from a communication perspective, and more in terms of the context, I'm doing lots of research on Israel, on the Olympic movement. And recently, in the last year or two, I started to feel more comfortable with the US context and started to write about brand American sports and US sports diplomacy. Hopefully in the next year or two, this effort will also manifest in accepted publications and whatnot.
So thanks for the introduction, Yoav. Sure. I would have invited you anyway to join a GeoSport discussion, because there's so much to talk about what Israel is doing right now with its sport. Perhaps we'll come on to that a little bit later, but I specifically asked you to come and join us today because you've just had a paper published in a Journal of Global Sport Management, and I'm just looking down at the screen below me to make sure I get the title exactly right. People-to-People Sports Diplomacy, Israel's Startup Nation in the 2020 Tour de France. Obviously, we're now right in the midst of the 2021 Tour de France. Israel's Startup Nation team is competing again. Right. I know you've certainly drawn some media coverage in France for your work and your comments on the team. So I'm wondering, can you tell us about the paper that you've published, what it focuses on, what it's about, and what some of the issues are that you draw out?
Yeah, so the paper itself, it was something that was building for a while as a Jewish Canadian billionaire, Sylvan Adams, started to be involved in different initiatives in branding Israel through sports and through cultural events as well, or innovation activities, mostly as a sponsor or a owner or co-owner. And as a cycling fan, he started or collaborated on as a co-owner in the Israeli Cycling Academy, which later on was accepted to the World Tour and changed its elite team's name to Israel Startup Nation. Now, and I was looking for a place where I could write something about his initiatives, because some of his initiatives very much resemble some of the initiatives that we see in the Gulf countries, whether it was hosting 3 days of Giro d'Italia in Israel, or whether it was sponsoring a friendly game between Uruguay and Argentina in Tel Aviv, or sponsoring Madonna or contributing to Madonna performing during the Eurovision in Israel a few years ago. So I was looking for a place to focus an article on his initiatives. And once Israel Startup Nation was accepted to the Tour de France, with the 2020 being a very unique year because of the COVID-19, I thought that this is the point that I need to focus an article on that and on how the cycling team is covered internationally. Now, I was somewhat disappointed by the results of some of the findings that I saw, because I mostly looked at the BBC, The Guardian, and Eurosport on their website. And they didn't pay too much attention to the branding of a cycling team as Israel Startup Nation. They were covering Israel Startup Nation as whenever there was someone in the top 10, none of the cyclists in the team won a stage. So it was more of a play-by-play. There was some, I broadened the search more to other news outlets, and most of the news outlets that focused on geopolitical aspects were either Israeli or Jewish, that focused on some BDS movement that were trying to persuade French athletes on Israel Startup Nation not to represent Israel. There was some more international interest in the signing of Chris Froome, who did not compete in 2020, but joined Israel Startup Nation later on. But it gave me an excuse to discuss the role of people-to-people sports diplomacy initiative of Sylvan Adams, because unlike what we see with the UAE team or with the Astana team, with the Kazakhstan team, with the team from Bahrain, or with some initiatives by Qatar, the Israel Startup Nation is not a state-led initiative for public diplomacy. It's a citizen who's leading that. There are some places in which it intersects with the state. One of them is the hosting 3 days of Giro d'Italia. Because here you needed the state. The state was also sponsoring part of the event, taxpayers' money, and obviously a lot of collaboration needed to allow 3 days of cyclists to go through the country. So that's basically what the paper is about, to discuss the role of a private initiative and people-to-people sport diplomacy, philanthropy, and diplomacy. Whether there's an impact on the image of Israel by having someone with Israel Startup Nation riding in or being covered on TV or shown on TV, whether that normalizes Israel as a country or changes its image, well, that remains to be seen. I would be somewhat skeptical about that. but it's a way to discuss Israel outside the context of the dispute until the dispute comes to challenge Israel's startup nation participation.
There's a lot in there to unpack, but if we can just pick out one or two things. So in terms of Adams's motives for setting up the team, what is your sense of why he did it?
So obviously this is something that burns inside him, that he's interested in leveraging Israel's image abroad. He in several interviews, he referred to him, or he was described as a self-appointed ambassador of the state of Israel. With that said, and he's very much embraced by nonprofits in Israel, by Sports for Development, the Paris Center for Peace, with some collaboration with the Israeli government. He also supports some innovation projects. So he takes this initiative on himself, but also, to be honest, there's also criticism about his initiatives in Israel, especially asking how does that team actually represent cycling culture in Israel, which I should say is growing. Or there is cycling culture, but not in that elite level. Mm-hmm. So most of the cyclists in the elite team are not Israel.
Mm-hmm. And so, do you think that he sees one of the legacies as being this creation of a talent pipeline, possibly of Israeli cyclists, or do you think that his goals and ambitions are, if you like, off the track or off the saddle, and it is much more about perceptions of Israel and personal passions?
I never met him, so I can't really speak to his stream of thought. I would say that he's focused very much on showcasing Israel and showcasing the non-conflict areas or sides of Israel. Also, mostly to be engaged with the international sphere. He brought, Israel Startup Nation competed in the UAE. He's very much into these kind of activities. He's also sponsoring the Israeli baseball team that will compete in the Tokyo Olympics, which is also a team full of naturalized athletes, most of them American Jews. And he saw a path through Europe, as baseball is not a big sport in Europe or not very developed in Europe, as a chance for Israel to reach the Olympics. And Israel was trying to reach the Olympics in team sports for quite a while now. So there are some collaboration with the states. I think with the state of Israel, but or with Israel Sports Organization. I think what he's aiming the most is to try to normalize the image of Israel, or try to show different sides of Israel that are not necessarily related to the armed conflict.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about being a citizen-led, right, if you like, diplomatic initiative, and you've talked about other Israeli communities around the world. So is it the case that diasporas play a part in this too, in terms of engaging with the team and messaging around the team, would you say?
So I think that the diaspora component relates more to the baseball initiative.
Right.
Because there's one of the laws in Israel is self-defined as a Jewish state, is that if you're Jewish, you can get Israeli citizenship. It means there's a law, the Shvut law in Hebrew, or the Chok HaShvut in Hebrew, or the return law in rough English translation, that if you're Jewish, you can return to your historic homeland, per se, and receive Israeli citizenship. And through that, this is why American Jewish baseball players received Israeli citizenship and could represent Israel. And through that, there's a connection to the diaspora. I would say that the strongest connection between Israel and Jewish diaspora through sport is through the state, is through the Maccabiah Games, through this is a quadrennial sport event, the Jewish Olympics, a multi-sport event every 4 years taking place in Israel, the last one had 8 countries, almost 10,000 or around 10,000 participants. So that is something that is very state-led. Sylvan Adams, well, it's more modest than that, but yes, there is that connection to the diaspora as well, especially also him being Canadian. I mean, he has Israeli citizenship, but he's an Israeli Canadian Jew. So, so there's also that diaspora component.
And Chris Froome, was it just a case of there's a great rider available, we'll sign him on a contract, or do you think Chris Froome served another diplomatic purpose or even a political purpose for the team?
I think it's, I mean, I'm not a cycling commentator to say what is the current condition of Chris Froome. Is he at his peak as he was 5-10 years ago or whatnot? I think he's a big name. And when you say Chris Froome, then even if you're not a hardcore cycling fan, you know that perhaps arguably the biggest name since Lance Armstrong or whatnot. So even if you're not a huge cycling fan, you know that the name Chris Froome. So having someone like that in Israel Startup Nation kind of leverages a bit the exposure of the team. I know that the expectations were also to win, because one thing that Simon Chadwick wants is to win, if not the Tour de France, then at least some stages. I'm not sure that they're on the path in this Tour de France. They won some stages in the Valletta, in the Giro d'Italia last year. They didn't win a stage in the Tour de France last year. I'm not sure if they'll win or not in this year, but the idea was both in terms of improving performance, but also to have a big name, a household name in cycling to raise attention to Israel Startup Nation. And
you mentioned there about bringing legitimacy to Israel, or to perceptions or notions of Israel. Could you tell us why you said that and what it means?
Yeah, so I've been doing quite a lot of research on Israel in the past 10 years or so. And while I don't think that Israel is defined by the conflict, the Israeli-Arab conflict and the Israel-Palestinian conflict definitely limit Israel's ability to use sports for nation branding and public diplomacy. Whenever the conflict escalates, sports events are either being canceled or postponed or moved abroad. Israel used to compete in Asia, then was scattered across the globe until in the 1990s was accepted to the European Olympic Committees and UEFA and whatnot, while it's not geographically in Europe. There are limitations to what Israel can use because of the conflict. And also there are limitations because Israel doesn't have a lot of venues and it's not really good at most of the sports and whatnot, or not most of the sport, but not in football at least, to have a significant nation branding impact. And one attempt in the last years or so by the Israeli government, which channels down also to sport, is to try and create bypassing messages to the conflict. Instead of the traditional hasbara explanation of trying to explain why Israel is acting the way Israel is acting, usually why Israel is trying to has the right to defend itself, or why it's using excessive force, to try and find ways to attract without forcing the foreign audiences to take a side. And that's what I meant by bypassing message. And it's not by coincidence that the name chosen for that team is not Travel Israel, Tourism Israel, El Al, or which is the Israel national airline, but Israel Startup Nation. To connect Israel with that idea of startup, with that idea of technology, innovation, which is something that the Israeli government, the Israeli industry, Israeli people, regardless of their political affiliations, they embrace that message and that part of the Israeli identity, of the adaptation, the innovation, startup, and whatnot.
So we'll come back to the idea of a startup nation in just a second. Just to continue in the vein of legitimacy and some elsewhere in the world would use this phrase sport washing to describe or to characterize Israel's activities. I mean, what's the reaction to that in Israel? Do people recognize that this term is being used, and if so, what is the typical response to it?
So I have some issues with the term sports washing. I see it a bit of a colonializing term coming from trying to frame these are the good countries and these are the bad countries who are using sports for nation branding and public diplomacy. As a counter reaction, I'm not sure that how deep I can talk about that or can give examples of aren't the Commonwealth Games a way of celebrating British imperialism, or the Francophone Games a way of celebrating French imperialism and whatnot. Oh, every time that you see these gestures for salute the troops in American football, don't you need to go into the economic relations between the armed forces and the NFL or whatever sports organization. So I kind of see it as the term itself. I have some issues with of trying to separate the world where they're not using sports the right way for nation branding and public diplomacy. But going back to
can I just say at that point,
yes,
Yoav, I do fully agree with you.
Well, thank you, but feel free to
no. I mean, we could stage this in a completely different setting and talk about sport washing, because I think there are the cultural associations with this term are really loaded, and it's a term that we don't particularly understand, and yes, it's very liberally used.
Yeah.
And from an academic standpoint, I think we need somebody to build a group of people who really research and understand. So thank you for your answer. I listened to that intently.
But I would say that it's a question of authenticity, because staging 3 days of Giro d'Italia in Israel raised some question about sports washing, and maybe there was a point to that, because this did not grow through grassroots in Israel. If you're seeing culture of basketball, Maccabi Tel Aviv, and hosting the Final Four or the Eurobasket or basketball events, that's something that is deeply in the roots of Israel sports fan and the Israeli experience, although there are quite a lot of American athletes competing in Israeli basketball. If you're looking at the Maccabiya games, while there is a strong connection to public diplomacy, this is also rooted within a genuine experience of Judaism and the state of Israel. Some of Sylvan Adams' initiatives very much resemble initiatives that you've seen in Qatar or in the UAE, having a game between Argentina and Uruguay. In Tel Aviv, I wasn't in Israel that time, and as much as I'm a fan of Luis Suarez, both as an Ajax fan and as a Liverpool fan, it felt uncomfortable to bring two South American teams to compete in Tel Aviv. So in that sense, yes, there are some aspects that to some Israelis at least feel uncomfortable, or at least unauthentic or not genuine. And to some say, well, other countries are doing that. At least we get to see Suarez and Messi instead of wasting the money of our parents going to the Camp Nou for their bar mitzvah trip.
And just as a quick aside to what we're discussing, for people who are unfamiliar with sport in Israel, what are the popular sports in Israel? What do people like to watch, and what do people like to play?
So I would say football. I mean, soccer, but football, and when talking to you, non-Americans, is the biggest one. Maccabi Haifa, Maccabi Tel Aviv, I'm a Maccabi Tel Aviv fan. Maccabi Tel Aviv, Apol Tel Aviv, Maccabi Haifa, Bitar Jerusalem, of course, with all connections and the controversy around them. These are the big teams. Also, European basketball, Maccabi Tel Aviv Basketball Club is one of the most decorated sports clubs in the world, won the European Championship 6 times, and is very much connected to the Israeli experience. So I would say both of these. If you're looking at the Olympic Games, you'll probably see more. Israel has better traditions in judo and in sailing. We'll see in Tokyo how things go. And there's going to be the largest delegation of Israel in the Tokyo Olympics. But so far, there's a glass ceiling of winning 2 medals. Let's see if that could be broken in Tokyo. Not an Olympic powerhouse by far, but there is some genuine tradition about judo. So I would also not claim that that the judo initiatives are ways of sports washing, because this is an authentic message. And I actually wrote a paper about Israel's use of sport for country image, or Israel's country image in the Rio Olympics, which I researched from Rio, from Brazil. And there were some aspects of judo of an Egyptian athlete not shaking hands with an Israeli sometimes. There are athletes from Muslim or Arabic countries who withdraw from the competition instead of facing an Israeli. There's a big case about the Iranian judo for doing that. So there's also aspects to that. I went far away from the question by now, but I think that it all, bring it back, it depends on the authenticity of the message.
Okay, just to pull you back a little further. Let's go back to Startup Nation. So this notion of there being an Israel startup nation, whether as a brand or as a market positioning, what does it actually mean, the Israel startup nation, and particularly in sport?
Right. So Israel Startup Nation, that's a title of a book by Dan Singer and Saul Zinger from about 2009 or 2010, 2011, depends on which version you're reading. That looks at Israel as a country that has been constantly adapting through the challenges it faced from its creation until now. And this is somewhat of a narrative that Israel adapts. That idea of constant adaptation, constant try and error, constant trying to creating solutions to problems, which goes very much even way before the state of Israel, the Jewish experience abroad, the being forced to adapt, facing anti-Semitism and facing and needing to move from one community to another. So along with a tradition of learning the Bible, the yeshiva, of a culture of learning, also that constant need to adaptation led to a culture of outside the box thinkers or universal thinkers who are trying to find solutions that could be adapted to different communities. And we see that in quite a few of Israeli innovators along the years, from Sigmund Freud to Karl Marx to Albert Einstein to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So regardless of that, of the field, you will find some Jewish thinkers who revolutionized their field. And we can also see that in sport before even going to Israel, especially the pre-World War, of some of the brightest minds in football, Hugo Meisel, Story Kirchner, Ernest Erbstein, Bela Gutmann also after the war, who basically built some of the powerhouses in the first part of the 20th century, the Austrian teams and the Hungarian teams and Hakoach Vienna. And obviously that declined after World War II or after in the 40s or during World War II and after. But we see that idea of innovation in in Jewish sport. In the US, we see it a bit differently, more in managers and ownership. Perhaps Red Auerbach with the great Boston Celtics. We see that, but with a lot of other Jewish GMs and owners. And in Israel, it's not so much on the athletic field, but because of the blooming startup industry, that according to Israeli organization, Israel is the #1 startup, has the most startups per capita in the world. I have not checked that, I'm quoting them, but in the realm of sports, this is where Israeli, it also manifested in the sport tech industry. In a sport tech industry that either sees Israel as a greenhouse of trying to see how the technology works in Israel before selling it abroad, or tries to develop a technology and then outsources it, or tries to make an exit abroad. And you see almost every major league will use some sort of Israeli technology. You see a lot in terms of artificial intelligence, broadcasting, automatic types of recording a sport event and editing it, that we don't need a sports editor, that can either go to broadcast or to a 2 minutes clip of the sport event that you can post on YouTube or on your website, or focusing on a specific player and giving that specific data to the coach or to a scout or whatnot. Really depends on what you're looking for. And it goes into fan engagement with different cell phone apps, goes into health and added fitness, smart stadiums. Barcelona Innovation is using a company called Pixelot. There's a company called Intelligim that was developed by former airport officers who took a simulator that trains airport pilots, Air Force, not airport, Air Force pilots. So Air Force officers that took a simulator or software or a technology that simulates training for Air Force pilots of taking decision in split seconds, and applied that into soccer, into football, and into hockey. And there are some Bundesliga teams and teams from the Dutch division, the PSV along them, and also Hockey Canada and Hockey USA that are using that to train athletes to make decisions in split seconds. And there are about 200 of these kinds of startups. Some are more successful, some are not. And this is something that is catching, that is growing, especially I would say in the last 5 years or so, or at least is more formalized in the last 3-4 years.
Okay. So what I would like to do, Yoav, is to draw this to a close now, and really just ask you to summarize for everybody who may watch or listen to this, in terms of Israel and sport, and its connections or its links to diplomacy, to nation branding, to soft power. This is a phrase that we've not introduced so far. Yeah. You know, if you had to sum it all up for us in 2 or 3 sentences, what should we be taking away from today's recording?
I think that, broadly speaking, with the exception of 2 aspects, the Maccabiah game, and we didn't talk about that, perhaps that's for another time, the diplomatic use of the Munich massacre, the terror attack against the Israeli athletes in Munich. Israel doesn't have a complete sports diplomacy. It's more coming from sometimes there are collaborations between citizens, the corporate world, and the Israeli government or Israeli sports organization when it fits. And sometimes it gets scattered along the way. To say that coherent sports diplomacy for Israel will significantly change the image of Israel, well, that's a claim that I will not make, because eventually, regardless if you hire an Israeli company, you hire an Israeli to to improve your AI technology or buy an Israeli company to do that. The Israeli-Arab conflict and Israel's policies are about the Israeli-Arab conflict and especially about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are somewhat questionable and need to be addressed as policies and not necessarily as with bypassing messages.
Okay, so Yoav Dubinsky, thank you very much to everybody who may listen to this or watch it. You can go to Google Scholar and check out Yoav's publications, and they're well worth reading. I think, as I mentioned at the start, they are the embodiment, I think, of what's happening right now in the world of sport. And your contribution to the community, Yoav, is greatly valued. So thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.